Thank you so much for joining tonight. Our second lecture out of 6 from Ross Garnaut. First, let me acknowledge the traditional owners of the land, the Wurundjeri people and their elders past and present. Technician, thank you. It's my great pleasure to have Ross Garnaut here tonight. He does not need an introduction. I do a little introduction anyway. He is professorial research fellow here at the University of Melbourne in economics. He has a long-standing academic career at our partner university ANU in Canberra, and partner university, as I say, because we collaborate with the ANU also on the Energy Transition Hub, in which also Ross Garnaut is playing a very important role. But he has been the director and is also president of much bigger in enterprises. He was chairman of several mining companies, also the Victorian aluminium smelters. He is now president of the renewable energy company Simex Zen. He has countless high-level political roles, including being the ambassador to China in the 1980s. The Garnaut Review of Climate Change in 2008 and its update in 2011 are therefore only one aspect of the multiple contributions that Ross Garnaut does to the public Australian debate on international relations, trade policy, and yes, climate change. Tonight's lecture is on the complex international and domestic economics of climate change. And let me introduce that topic just by making a very simple point. In the 30 years to 2017, we installed in Australia 12 gigawatts of renewable energy. In the 3 years now, 2018 to 2019 and 2020, we are going to install another 12 gigawatts. So the very simple message from economics is now the driving force in the transition. Before, we needed the moral argument that we need to reduce emissions and there are all the side benefits, etc. Now economics is simply the driving force. The question is the driving force fast enough? Do we do the transition in time? And that's where it becomes complex, because we have multiple hurdles on the way. And tonight's lecture on the complex aspects of economics will be on the economic instruments, on the foundation of the economics, and also on the institutions that are necessary, like the Clean Energy Finance Corporation, ARENA, etc. So with that, please join me in welcoming Ross Garnaut for a fascinating second lecture in our 6th lecture talk. Thank you, Ross.
Thanks, Marty. Welcome, everyone. This follows, is that working okay? This follows last week's presentation, 2 weeks ago's presentations in some respects, but I'm going to focus especially on the framework, the economic framework for making policy decisions about climate change that I set out in my 2008 review and updated in 2011, and asked the question, what's changed that might affect our judgments about the economic effects of climate change mitigation and climate change since then. I set out a framework for an economic framework for taking decisions on mitigation elaborately in chapter 1 of the 2008 review, and in chapter 11 I applied that empirically. In 2008, I compared the costs and benefits to Australia of several levels of climate change mitigation by drawing on elaborate studies of both. That's still the first economy-wide attempt at modeling the costs of unmitigated climate change. And I also worked in detail on modeling the costs of mitigation so that I could compare the costs of climate change avoided by mitigation against the costs of mitigation. And the bottom line was that I thought that I judged that the costs of mitigating at 3 degrees were clearly less, even if you took only simple economic effects into account. Those costs were outweighed by the benefits of avoiding climate change. At 2 degrees, the costs this century of mitigation were pretty closely matched by the benefits this century of mitigation if you simply focused on narrow economic effects. But the case was overwhelming for mitigation at 2 degrees if you took account of effects beyond the year 2100. The modelling only went out to the year 2100. And if you took account of values beyond those reflected in market exchange. I didn't look at more ambitious objectives. I didn't look at 1.5 degrees, except to say that to get to 1.5 degrees, you would first have to demonstrate that there was a path to holding temperature increases to 2 degrees. The range I took, 2 to 3 degrees, was at the strong mitigation end of the range of discussion at that time. You might recall that Nick Stern's pioneering study provided to the British government in 2006, published in 2007, concluded that we should aim for 3 degrees of warming, and his justification of that, rather than something stronger, was driven by practical considerations of difficulties of getting to below 3 degrees. Nordhaus at Yale, who's recently received a Nobel Prize in economics, the most recent Nobel Prize for his work on climate change, he thought that the degree of mitigation that would balance costs and benefits, economic costs and benefits, was higher than 3 degrees. So in looking at a range 2 to 3 degrees and coming down on 2, I was at the strong end of the serious economic discussion. The earlier elaborate work on costs and benefits of mitigating climate change had been undertaken by Klein, now the Peterson Institute in Washington, Nordhaus and Stern. There was one large difference between what I was doing and what they did, and this difference required a different methodology. Klein, Nordhaus and Stern sought to determine whether and the extent to which mitigation made sense for the world as a whole. My reviews sought to answer the question of whether and the extent to which mitigation made sense for just one country, Australia. It's actually an easier question whether mitigation is justified for the world as a whole than for one country. And why it's easier is that an assessment of whether mitigation action is justified for an individual country must deal with all of the complexities that others had addressed for the world as a whole, plus one. And that additional source of complexity is the most difficult of all. The global mitigation effort is the sum of the separate but interrelated mitigation decisions of individual sovereign countries. I discussed in 2008 how what one country did would influence but not determine the approach of others. Recognition of this reality led to the development of the approach to international cooperation that was discussed in Lecture 1 in the series 2 weeks ago. And here I take that international framework as given and simply discuss the framework suggested for Australian decision-making. Well, comparing the costs and benefits of climate change mitigation, how do we go? I posed the questions in 2008, would the substantial costs of mitigation be exceeded by avoided costs of climate change? And what degree of mitigation would lead to the largest net benefits? The costs of mitigation come early, and they are relatively straightforward. They're amenable to quantification through standard general equilibrium economic modeling techniques. And because they're relatively straightforward, there's a lot more focus on them than on the benefits of avoiding climate change. That's really complicated. The benefits of mitigation come late, and only some of them are amenable to quantitative analysis. I expressed concern in 2008 that quantification of some of the benefits of mitigation would lead to devaluation of the rest, and that concern was fully justified by the subsequent commentary. The 2008 review introduced a quadripartite typology for costs of climate change and therefore benefits of mitigation. I illustrate this in the next chart. And I carry this framework right through the review. If we think of what utility, a standard of living, welfare of the community would be if there was no such thing as climate change. And then I categorize 4 types of costs of climate change. One were those that operated through markets, fall in wheat yield or an increase in the cost of infrastructure because you'd have to make the infrastructure more robust to handle more difficult climate conditions. These could be put through a standard model. Type 2 costs were costs of the same size, same kind, in principle amenable to standard economic analysis, economic effects felt through markets, but about which quantification was not possible in any precise way. And how I handled these was to use a Bayesian process of making the people who knew best guess about what the quantities were. Type 3 costs of climate change and type 3 benefits of avoiding climate change, the chance of extreme outcomes. 1 and 2 were based on the science's judgment about median impacts, but there's a wide range of uncertainty about those impacts. For example, sea level change. There are certain median expectations, most likely expectations, but it might be more benign or might be much more severe. Humans usually are prepared to pay quite a lot for insurance against the possibility, even the low probability of extreme outcomes. You pay quite a lot to insure your house because the cost of it burning down and not being rebuilt will be catastrophic. And so there's insurance value in avoiding extreme outcomes. That's in addition to the value of avoiding the median expectations of impact, which was covered by 1 and 2. And the fourth type of effect was values that simply can't be picked up through measures of market transactions. Most Australians would think it was a big loss for us to lose Ningaloo Reef, but the loss of Ningaloo Reef might not actually affect GDP very much. I did look at the damage to the Great Barrier Reef and tried and calculated what the impact on the economy would be. I counted that as a type 1 cost of climate change or type 1 benefit of mitigation. But if we lost the Great Barrier Reef, we would feel a loss quite independently of what it did to the North Queensland tourist industry. Similarly, a lot of Australian heritage, cultural history is bound with the history of the Murray-Darling Basin. The unmitigated climate change, all that science told us, would lead to a 90% reduction in irrigation agriculture and the loss of many communities through that. Well, you can calculate the loss of agricultural production as a type 1 benefit, but to lose all of that history, that tradition, would be something that we would feel strongly. Many Australians would feel a loss at wide-scale loss of species through climate change. It probably wouldn't affect measured GDP very much. That's another type 4 benefit. So I separated these out, did very detailed modeling on 1 and 2, but asked readers of my report to keep 3 and 4 in mind. I did quite a lot of work pointing out what some of those losses would be and some benefits of avoiding them through mitigation without trying to quantify those effects. This typology, keeping those 4 types of costs of climate change and benefits of avoiding them separate and asking readers to form judgments about them separately, I still think is the right approach. It's not the only approach. Nick Stern, in his very elaborate modeling in his big review, used Monte Carlo simulations to wrap extreme events into measures of expected value. If there was a 1% chance of a $100 million loss, he would count that as 1% of $100 million, $1 million. It wasn't really measuring insurance value of extreme events. I'm comfortable about the methodology that I applied. Well, right through the report, I kept these 4 types of benefits of mitigation in mind. And in the review, I used a diagram plotting utility against time into the future with and without varying levels of mitigation. And as my team and I worked on the review, we often would refer back to this diagram. And it hasn't been much discussed, but in looking at what's changed since 2008, I think it's quite useful to go back to the diagram. And this is the climate change fish. Is this blocking a view? Probably is. Does that help? Yeah. The yellow or orange line, the vertical axis is utility, welfare for the community as a whole. And this is time on the horizontal axis. The yellow or orange line is utility without mitigation. Utility rising over the time with normal growth in living standards. The last 100 years, average living standards, material living standard risen by about 1% per annum. And that could be expected to continue with productivity growth and capital intensification. But at very least, it will be challenged by climate change and level out at some time in the future. If we mitigate against climate change, we will pay something in terms of material welfare, material well-being in the early stages. So utility will dip for a while, but then at some point later in time will be higher because we will have avoided the effects of climate change. That's the climate change fish, and whether mitigation is worth doing depends on whether the tail of the fish is bigger than the body of the fish. A more ambitious mitigation target, or a change that increases the cost of reducing emissions, causes the belly of the fish to fall below where it would otherwise be. So if this was mitigation for a 3-degree target, it will cost us more to aim for a 2-degree target, but we'll get greater benefits of avoided climate change later on. Another way of looking at the fish is to say if we're only considering type 1 and 2 benefit, utility without mitigation, if we're really sophisticated about it and took into account type 3 and 4 mitigation, then utility without mitigation is actually lower, and the crossover point between mitigation costs exceeding benefits of mitigation would come earlier. And in one case where this will strengthen, taking more costs of climate change into account will increase the case for mitigation. That's not the whole story, because in comparing the size of the body of the fish and the tail of the fish, we have to take into account the fact that some people will want us to value the welfare of people living now, us, more highly than the welfare of people living later. This is the question of the discount rate. And I'm going to spend most of my time this evening talking about the discount rate, which is very important to comparing the size of the body of the fish to the tail of the fish. Those of you who read my second climate change review for the Multi-Party Committee on Climate Change and for the Gillard government may recall that I introduced it by telling a story about the discussion of the discount rate that I'd had when I presented my paper on this to the Multi-Party Committee. Julia Gillard was in the chair, and when I started talking about the discount rate, all their eyes glazed over. Bob Brown was obviously off in the sticks, thinking about more ennobling things. Tony Windsor and Rob Oakeshott were finding other things to read, and the Treasurer and the Prime Minister weren't actually paying much attention. And then I said, if you use the standard discount rates that in business are used for discounting benefits from an equities investment, then even if climate change was to lead to the extinction of our species in 100 years' time, you would still go on and not mitigate it. And Julia Gillard, who was a very good chair of meetings, sat up and with a big grin on her face said, well, you've got us there, Ross. That's the first decision of this committee. We're against the extinction of our species. So the question of the discount rate for most people is the dullest of subjects until you realize its implication, and then it's quite engaging. And I'm going to talk about it a lot today. Well, discussion of the discount rate has changed quite a lot since 2008, and overall it's probably the most important thing that has changed in the last 11 years. If you ask me what has changed that affects views on whether ambitious mitigation is worthwhile. For those of you who aren't economists or finance people, this will be unfamiliar and possibly boring, but I hope you'll bear with me because the consequences are not boring. 3 separate discount rates enter analysis of the costs and benefits of climate change mitigation. And in the economics literature, there's been great confusion about this, and I think we've been led down some wrong tracks because of that confusion. One of the discount rates relates to the relative size of the fish's body and tail. This is the rate at which we value a change in utility of wealth or welfare of people living today relative to the utility of people living in future. I call this the intertemporal utility discount rate. The intertemporal utility discount rate has 3 components. A pure rate of time preference. Believe it or not, it's quite common. It's universal in finance and quite common in economics to think that we should value welfare in the present more strongly than welfare of people living in future. The second element of the intertemporal utility discount rate is that a downgrading of a unit of welfare for people in future is justified because they are expected to be richer. It's quite common and valid to say that the community as a whole is better off if we take some income as taxation of very high incomes and provide social security for people on very low incomes. Well, if we're comparing the welfare of people today with people in 100 years' time, given what has happened under modern economic growth for the last quarter of a millennium, living standards do rise over time. So on average, people in 100 years' time can be expected to have higher consumption, higher material standards of living than people today. And so on income distribution grounds, there's some justification for valuing our incomes more highly than theirs, because we're poorer in a material sense than they will be. And the third reason for discounting the future to some extent is that we're back to the extinction of our species. The extinction of our species could precede enjoyment of all the benefits of climate change mitigation. And at the ANU, I was a good mate of Professor Des Ball, who did a lot of the foundational work on avoiding nuclear war, the game theory that later President Carter said avoided nuclear war. And living with those conversations, you don't think that the probability of extinction of our species over the next 100 years is zero. And so it'd be a pity to spend an awful lot of income now avoiding climate change for benefits in 100 years if no one's going to be around to enjoy it. So I allowed a little bit for that, and I followed Nick's turn in that. Of these three components, the allowance for possible extinction before we enjoyed the benefits was very small, 0.05%. And I formed the view that there was no justification for a pure preference for the present over the future. When we really think about it, I think that's what most of us think. It's not what Nordhaus has written into all of his work. It's not part of most of the economic literature. It is what Nick Stern did. I think Nick was right. John Quiggin, an economist from Queensland, put a submission to my review, and he put it in a homely way. He said most people value the welfare of their children as much as their own, and we can expect our children to value the welfare of their children as much as their own, so on until the end of time. So what is the justification for valuing the welfare of people living in future less than the value of people living today? In the discussion of my draft report, I had public meetings all over Australia, and one of these was in the town of Port Macquarie, which is full of retirees, and I got a lot of protests about that. A lot of elderly people about the age I am now said, no, you've got it wrong. We value the welfare of our grandchildren much more than our children. So if everyone had that view of the future, then of course we would put very high value on welfare of people in the distant future. But I took the view that there was no ethical reason for valuing the welfare of people in future less highly than people today, simply because they were in the future. But there was an income distribution reason that for valuing the present more than the future that we have to take seriously. And I ended up judging that the appropriate intertemporal utility discount rate for Australia was in the range of 1.35% to 2.65% in real terms. A tiny part of that was the extinction possibility, but most of it derived from recognition that Australia's material living standards would be higher in future. And that came out of all of my modelling. It was fairly standard at the time. And the initial modelling was the most elaborate modelling of the Australian economy and the longest dated modelling that had been conducted then and has been conducted since. It began with the support of the state treasuries and the Centre of Policy Studies at Monash University, which I think is the best group of general equilibrium modelers in Australia. They're now at Victoria University. But after my exercise went from being a state-based exercise with the support of all the states and territories to a Commonwealth and state exercise after the election of the Rudd government, the Commonwealth Treasury joined me. And so both in my publications and in Treasury publications around that time, we referred to the Garnaut Treasury modelling. And that modelling generated a 1.3% average increase in consumption of Australians over the rest of the century. And that meant that people in 100 years' time, in material terms, would be quite a lot better off than people today. I used the range 1.3 to 2.6%, although I argued that the case was strong for 1.3 rather than 2.6, simply because in the literature there was some argument that income distribution reasons warranted a larger discount for the future. I noted in my report that our willingness to redistribute income through taxation and social security from the rich to the poor suggested that we actually weren't that keen on income distribution, that the 1.3 was warranted. But I used both so that my choice of discount rate would not be a point that blocked people from coming on board. Some eminent economists, including Nordhaus, the Nobel Prize winner now, and in Australia, the substantial economist and public servant Ian Castles, who died a few years ago, had suggested that a much higher discount rate was appropriate than my 1.35 to 2.65. They argued that the rate at which business discounts future cash flows in decisions on current investments is the appropriate one. They said we should use a market rate and looked at that business investment rate. I disputed the relevance of the market interest rate for this purpose, for the intertemporal utility discount rate, but said that if a market rate were to be used, the relevant market rate was the long-term sovereign bond rate. That was the market rate at which Australians were prepared to lend to their government. And it happened that the range of 1.35 to 2.65% straddled the historical average Australian real long-term bond rate. So I looked at the issue from a number of angles, and I think I had a very defensible view. And the conclusions I came to about 3 degrees mitigation being warranted and 2 degrees being more strongly warranted was based on that range of discount rates. In the review, I drew attention to several qualifications of the case for discounting the future on income distribution grounds. Remember, most of that discount rate is on income distribution grounds, that people in future will be richer than we are. First, people are likely to value non-market environmental and heritage services much more highly relative to increases in conventional consumption, when incomes and material consumption are much higher than they are today. Climate change may greatly diminish the availability of non-market services for future generations. As a result, one could not be sure that despite much higher material consumption, the average utility of people in future will be greater than the average utility today. Hence, devaluing future relative to present utility so heavily in recognition that people in future will be better off than those today may lead to excessive discount rates. Further, if significant weight is given to the bad end of the probability distribution of outcomes from climate change, there is a possibility that utility may be lower for many people in future than at present. The second reason for being uneasy about discounting of utility of the future relative to the present because they'll be richer, is that when I was doing this work in 2007, 2008, we were at the height of the China incomes boom, and also we'd started to experience lower productivity growth. And so really for completeness, for analytic completeness, I noted that it might not necessarily be the case that people in future will be richer than people in 2007 and 2008. Since then, of course, we've had stagnation of income. At the time, this possibility was mentioned for completeness. It seems more relevant today. Third, more than any other developed country, Australia can be expected to have a much higher population at the end of this century than today as a result of immigration. And my calculations of costs and benefits were all made in terms of percentages of GDP. But we'd be talking about increments of income for a lot more people in future. In Australia, if you did the same calculation for other developed countries, you wouldn't have that same consideration working. And so the fact that there would be many more Australians in the future when they'd be affected by climate change and benefit from mitigation is another reason why we might be cautious about discounting the future too much. I didn't take these qualifications into the main analysis, I just mentioned them. If they had been taken into the main analysis, they would have strengthened the case for strong mitigation. But I actually didn't need them to strengthen the case because I got the strong conclusion about 2 degrees anyway. There's a great confusion in the economic literature over the appropriate discount rate, including, maybe especially, in the pioneering work of Nordhaus, which otherwise I admire. Much of the confusion arises out of failure to distinguish the intertemporal utility discount rate from 2 other interest rates that are important in determining the size and shape of the fish. The 2 other rates relate to business decisions. I call them the business rate and the hoteling rate. It really is appropriate to apply a market-related business discount rate to changes in levels of investment in producing goods and services that result from mitigation. If you spend a lot of money on mitigation now, there'll be less investment more generally in producing goods and services in the economy. And on average, the return on that investment, or historical average, will be about 4% in real terms. It is justified in an economic calculation to count that as a cost to the economy. That 4% was embodied in all of my detailed modeling. On this rate of return on business investment, the assumption of my modeling didn't vary very much from those of other models, including those of Nordhaus. Nordhaus's difference was that he was saying that that sort of rate should be applied to the discounting of, or the pure rate of time preference and the intertemporal utility discount rate, and not just to the rate of return on changes in levels of investment. Nordhaus acknowledged in a book after the Stern report that the main difference between him and Stern on the conclusions they reached on the amount of mitigation that was justified, Nordhaus being higher than Stern's 3%, 3 degrees, arose out of differences in discount rates. So the question that I'm focusing on turned out to be a crucial one. The third discount rate, and this is really for students of economics, but it's also fundamentally important, I think, to understanding the issues, is what I call the hoteling rate. I was the first person to bring this issue into the discussion of climate change. The hoteling rate is closely related to the budget approach to allocating mitigation responsibilities. The atmosphere's capacity safely to absorb greenhouse gases can be seen as a finite resource. that is depleted by the emission of greenhouse gases at any time. Conceptualizing the problem in this way allows us to draw on the economics of optimal depletion of a finite resource. And why I call it the Hotelling rate is that the seminal work in this field is an article by Hotelling in the Quarterly Journal of Economics. Way back in 1931, my colleague Anthony Clunies-Ross and I applied this in some work related to optimal depletion of mineral resources in 1983. We're used to thinking about these depletion questions in resource economics. The market will generate a price for the resource in situ, and that price of a mineral in location will rise at an appropriate interest rate. And I was suggesting that we should look at the atmosphere's capacity to absorb greenhouse gases without catastrophic effects as a finite resource. There's a certain total amount available. If we go beyond that, we get very bad results. That's the budget approach to emissions. And if we look at it in that way, we can use all of the well-developed economics of optimal depletion of a resource, and that tells us that the price of that resource will rise over time at a discount, at a certain interest rate. And I gave reasons in the review and in my modelling that later became the Garnaut Treasury modelling why 4% was an appropriate rate. While the literature, the economic literature before my review generally accepted that the carbon price should rise over time, there is confusion about the analytic basis of the rising price. It is sometimes argued that uncertainty about the appropriate price justifies an easy start, so that the losses from a false start are low. Rigorous analysis does not support this argument. The possibility that the cost of climate change may turn out to be much lower or much higher than the mean of current expectations may justify a higher starting price, would never justify a lower starting point. Separately, Nordhaus in 2008 and others suggested the optimal price should rise over time because the marginal cost of damage is rising with increasing accumulations of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. That too is an erroneous explanation for a rising price. An early ton of carbon dioxide emissions does as much damage, possibly more, because its damaging effects are felt over a longer period. The analysis is different for some of the short-lived and high-impact greenhouse gases. Carbon price should rise simply because there's an economic opportunity cost from delaying the utilization of scarce capacity to emit greenhouse gases. This is analogous to the rising price of a ton of an economically valuable and scarce mineral resource that can be utilized now or later. So, having talked about the role of and some of the economic discussion of the discount rate, I want to now examine how things have changed since the review. I want to draw attention to an historic reduction of global interest rates. For most of the quarter millennium of modern economic development, real interest rates on low-risk securities varied around 4 to 6% in real terms in the leading capital markets. There were variations around the average, but no persistent tendency to change in one direction or another. This relationship formed the foundations of Thomas Piketty's pessimistic prognosis on the future of capitalism. Reuben Finnegan and I have explored the basis for this relationship in our work on capitalism, authoritarianism, and democracy in the 21st century. The Piketty view contrasts with that of John Maynard Keynes, who I think is the greatest economist of the 20th century and undoubtedly is the most influential. Keynes expressed the view that under mature capitalism, capital would be cheap and abundant with real interest rates near zero. He put that view into an essay he wrote in 1931, and he was talking about mature capitalism 100 years hence, so he's talking about 2031. So this question of what will happen to interest rates, real interest rates over time, ends up being a story of many parts. But there's no doubting an empirical reality that long-term real interest rates set in capital markets have declined decisively in the last several decades and over the last decade. And here I use two charts. This one only goes up to 2013, but this is index bonds. This is real interest rates after taking out the effects of inflation. You see that, especially since the global financial crisis, they jumped up during the crisis, so money was scarce and access to it uncertain. But since then, these charts go back to the beginning of the century. If you go back before that, not all countries had index bonds, but you would have been up here, up around 3, 4, 5%. Since the beginning of this century, there's been a downward tendency in real interest rates. And around 2011, 2012, they fell below zero. And if you continued this to the present, and in the book that comes out in June, I'll update this. I couldn't quickly get my hands on an updated series, but you'll see that it bounces around a bit below zero since then. That's a really historic change. And if we look at nominal interest, 10-year bond yields, not without taking away inflation, they're distinctly lower in recent years, certainly since my 2008 review, than they have ever been. And on average, in recent years, a majority of the populations of developed countries have lived in countries with around zero long-term bond rates, 10-year bond rates. So my work with Reuben Finnegan explains historically low interest rates in terms of major structural changes in the global economy. These structural changes will be subject to variations over time, but they won't be reversed. Our view is that this is a permanent change and one with great consequences. While the tendency towards lower long-term rates was evident at the time of the 2008 and 2011 reviews, and I made reference to it, its persistence since then through a long expansion in global economic activity confirms its historic importance and likely durability. Decisively lower costs of capital have a number of effects on discount rates, affecting the shape of the climate change fish and the relative sizes of the body and the tail. Lower market long-term interest rates have no direct effect on a soundly computed intertemporal utility discount rate. Remember, I gave the reasons why market rates are not relevant to it. To the extent that they partly reflect a downward step in productivity growth, however, and opportunity for continued gains from capital intensification, they are associated with weakening the justification of favouring current generation's utility on income distribution grounds. The causes of this are also causes of stagnation in income. So the set of phenomena that lie behind this become a reason to be cautious about discounting future incomes because they'll be higher. There's reason now to wonder if they will be. Lower intertemporal utility discount rates increase the benefits relative to the costs of mitigation. They increase the length and width of the fish's tail. They increase the value of any given area of fish's tail relative to the equivalent area of body. They favour stronger and earlier mitigation. And the links are not my justification for the intertemporal utility discount rates I use, but the links between the causes of this and rises of incomes. Now, for economists like Nordhaus or Castles, who say we should be using a market rate to discount the future, then their argument has been undercut by developments in capital markets. If you use the market rate today, you get very different outcomes from using the rates they used a decade ago. The effects of lower market interest rates on the business rate are more complex. In competitive economies, they would flow directly into the cost of capital. Finnegan and I have drawn attention to the growing role of monopoly in the developed countries, demonstrated for Australia in recent studies of the energy, banking and other sectors by the ACCC and the Productivity Commission. Monopoly can hold up average returns to capital while reducing returns in the competitive parts of the economy. The latter perhaps falling to lower levels than they would through the influence of lower interest rates. The overall effect is to reduce the business rate applying to new investment. This reduces the cost of any reductions in investment in producing goods and services that is caused by mitigation. It also reduces the cost of the new investment that is required in low emissions activities. There's one other influence at play, and it's a powerful one. The differentiated effect of lower costs of capital across more and less capital-intensive industries. This is important because the new low emissions technologies are much more capital-intensive than the high emissions activities that they replace. The costs of renewable energy and storage are dominated by capital. The costs of renewable energy and storage contain almost no operating costs. So it's the depreciation rate and the discount rate that determine the cost of renewable energy and storage. On the other hand, the cost of conventional power, coal or gas-based power, are dominated by current costs. They don't get a benefit or don't get a large one from the falling cost of capital. So the falling cost of capital decisively shifts advantage from conventional energy to renewable energy. Something very similar happens in new versus conventional technologies in the industrial sector. You can produce nitrogen fertilizers, or at least the ammonia that goes into nitrogen fertilizers, from renewable energy through electrolysis or from coal and gas. If you use coal and gas, the operating costs are quite high. If you use electrolysis running renewable energy through water, the operating costs are very low. It's mainly the capital cost of the electrolysis machine. And as a result, a fall in interest rates decisively improves the competitiveness of the new technologies, the low emissions technologies, compared with the old technologies. In the land sector in Australia, where there are massive opportunities for sequestration, these are very capital intensive investments where you invest heavily for a period and then you wait a very long time for the trees to grow. These are favored by a low cost of capital. I should mention one other, just to complete the discussion of interest rates. The hoteling interest rate falls with long-term interest rates. And this causes the price of carbon to rise in early relative to later years. And through market processes, that would tend to force stronger and earlier mitigation. So through developments in interest rates, all three interest rates are affected in the same direction, favoring early and strong mitigation. Well, I deliberately have spent quite a long time on the discount rate because it's an under-discussed area, and I think it's the most important thing that has changed in the economics of climate change mitigation since my review. But in my prepared lecture, I've got quite a lot on Australian policy, Australian institutions, but I chose to focus on this new question of considerable importance rather than going through that detail. And that'll be a chapter of the book that will come out in June. You won't have to wait very long for that. And to leave a few minutes for discussion, I'll just finish the lecture by coming back to what has happened to the size of the fish. How will the fish look today? So back to chart number 2. So if we look at all the things that have changed since 2008, how's the fish changed? Well, the belly has lifted by a large amount. And that's partly the effects of the lower business rate attached to investment. That's reduced the cost of mitigation. It's partly a reduction in the hoteling rate. But it's also, there's a third, well, apart from interest rates, the second powerful factor is the dramatic reduction in costs of the low emissions technology. So far, these have been mainly in generation of renewable electricity. In all of my modeling, after consulting with people who know these things best in Australia and Europe and America and China, I wrote into the modeling assumption of about 3% per annum reduction in costs of photovoltaic solar power generation. Well, in the years since then, we've had over 85% reduction in costs of photovoltaic panels. That lifts the belly of the fish. And I think the belly of the fish is also contracted because opportunities for low-cost mitigation in Australia that in chapter 22 of my 2008 report and chapter 10 of my 2011 report, I presented as interesting and potentially important but speculative opportunities in the land sector. Further work has suggested that they are possibly very large. So the belly's lifted a lot. The back of the fish has also contracted. The most important cause have been increased awareness of the insurance value of mitigation and of the value of the natural and civilizational heritage that is threatened by climate change. This has mainly been learning and thinking about the risks and the ethics. And I think there have been many contributions to this, but the most important contributor to taking more seriously the civilization and ethical questions, the values that aren't simply economic values, is the encyclical of Pope Francis a couple of years ago, which has been very influential, and not only amongst the 1/3 of humanity that professes commitment to Christian faith, but more general discussion of ethics has led people more and more to the sort of concern for the natural environment that I considered as part of those type 4 benefits of mitigation. And then, so we've ended up we've ended up with a skinnier fish, a garfish instead of a Port Phillip snapper. The reduction of the intertemporal utility discount rate has elongated the tail. It's less controversial now to use the sorts of intertemporal discount rates that Nick Stern and I used than it was then. And Nordhaus hasn't conceded on the analytically, but he's found other reasons for favouring stronger mitigation. He attaches more value to the insurance value of mitigation these days. And so these have come closer together. The crossover point comes earlier. The tail has become much bigger. So we've sort of got a garfish with a humpback whale's tail. The 2 degrees objective was amply justified in 2008. The changes in the shape of the fish would justify substantially stronger and earlier mitigation today. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ross. I wouldn't have thought that after this lecture, we all can hope for the fish being belly up. If the costs of new renewables is below the costs of existing fossil fuel generation, the blue line will be above the orange line, the fish will be belly up, and everything will go very fast. So thank you very much for that. The floor is open now for questions. I start here.
Oh, yes, hello, my name's Greg Kemp. I found that very informative, and thank you. I understand that if that was the whole world doing that, I could understand it, but without the whole world taking these mitigation processes, I wonder what's going to happen, because I read in the newspaper about 2 weeks ago that China is planning to build 170 gigawatts of new or restarted fossil fuel power stations. They put this into the context that Australia has in total about 50 gigawatts of generating capacity from all sources. So it came across that China's going to be really cranking up their fossil fuel power stations.
Yes, I think that is an exaggeration. China is still opening some new coal-based power stations. It's closing down many, many more times coal-based power stations than it's opening. It's closing down older and less efficient power stations and opening a smaller number and smaller capacity of new ones. I discussed this last week. I discussed the international regime last week. If Australians are worried that we're doing more than our share if we follow this, then I can assure them there's no risk of that. When I did my original report, one of the innovations in it was that I did point out that the development model in China did mean that emissions growth then, well, from the beginning of the century until 2008, if that continued for a couple of decades, it didn't matter what the rest of the world was doing. That's your point. We would not be able to hold temperature increases within reasonable bounds. For a number of years, I followed those developments very closely, and for the book in June, I'm going to update some charts I presented 2 or 3 years ago. But there was a massive change in trajectory in Chinese emissions around 2012. And the drivers for that were several. One of them was concern about climate change. There's a lot of good science in China. And the good scientists in China have a lot of access to the political leadership. So there's a lot of Chinese concern about their own vulnerability to climate change, and what they do really does affect global climate change. But there was also Chinese concern about the effects of atmospheric pollution especially from coal. A dramatic study jointly by the Chinese Academy of Science and the US Academy of Science about 5 years ago on why life expectancy was 5.5 years lower north of the Huayu River in China than south. And the explanation was, well, the main reason from this joint scientific study was air pollution, mainly particulates from coal combustion in the north. And China's not a democratic state, it's a strong authoritarian state, but the Communist Party leadership does have to respond to strong community views, and there was a strong community view about that. And so that was a driver for change. Other strategic reasons for changing the shape of the economy were influential. China was also worried about increased vulnerability to reliance on imported fossil fuels from countries that it had uneasy relationships with. Saudi Arabia might blow up, and Australia might side with the US in a blockade against China and if there were military tensions. So there were strategic reasons. And then the final reason for China taking big steps in mitigation was that it saw an opportunity to be a leader of producing the capital goods for the low emissions economy. And it set out to be a leader in that. And of course, they've become the world's main source of photovoltaic panels. So they've been an important part of the dramatic reduction in the cost of panels, wind turbines, now the electric car. I'll be talking about the transport evolution in the fourth lecture. The China story is a very important part of that. They've got a commitment to have 5 million electric cars on the road by next year, including a couple of million produced next year. That will start giving the economies of scale to bring the costs of electric cars down globally. So if you simply, and I'll have this chart in the book, but if you simply plot emissions from the coal power, from the electricity generation sector, they were 10% per annum until about 2012. And the whole of the growth in China's electricity demand since then has been sourced from zero emission sources. The largest is still hydro. Most rapidly growing is solar. Wind will soon be the largest. Nuclear is quite large. Biomass is quite large. But the whole of the growth of emissions has been the whole of the growth of power generation has been from zero emission sources over the last 6 or 7 years. So
we have many questions. We have one question here, then we have a lot of online viewers who also have questions, and then we come back here, and maybe afterwards a female from the auditorium. Thank you. So first you.
I think that's possibly the longest lecture on economics I've listened to in my life and stayed largely awake, so thank you for that. My question is in relation to...
The rest are not mainly about economics.
My question is about the orange line going out into the future. I would have thought with the scenarios of 5 and 6 degrees warming, or even going higher than that, that utility would actually decrease rather than levelling off. I just wonder if you could explain your justification for going levelling.
Well, this doesn't put a date on it.
No, I realise that. But because obviously if it drops off, that opens the tide further.
My view, and it's written into the report, I didn't pull any punches in that 2008 report or the 2011 one. I think if you had unmitigated climate change, then it's unlikely that the global political order would hold together. I think it would be that disruptive. You don't have to shock a political system very much for things to fall apart. We've seen that in a lot of cases a lot recently. And at 6 degrees and the displacement of people, especially in our region, really, the densely populated countries of Asia, it would be such, it's impossible to see. I think it's, well, unlikely to the point of impossibility that a stable political order would be maintained. And their problems would be our problems as one relatively small country in that region. We freak out at a few dozen refugees, a few dozen, hundreds of millions would probably freak us out more.
Thank you. And I just remind you, we were told about hotelling rate. We were also told about the utility shape in the form of a humpback whale's fin, which is way bigger than the shrew. So there was it was alluded to that it goes down. So now, question from the auditorium, from the online viewers.
Thank you, Malta. We've had a number of questions online. This one comes from Alan Barley, who asks, how does the assumption of future real incomes remaining equal with present incomes stack up against the massive and accelerating climate-caused rundown of the planetary resources and the natural environment that are essential to mankind? For example, water, arable land, and weather and ocean, sea level rise impacts.
Yeah, well, that's really quite closely related to the last question. Unmitigated climate change, I think, would not be consistent with maintenance maintenance of current living standards in the developed countries, let alone continued increases of them, and even projecting those sorts of income growth levels out to the end of this century. And remember, most of the bigger climate change effects are beyond this century, but even projecting it out to the end of the century and not imagining catastrophic implications in the absence of mitigation, I think is unrealistic. So it's reasonable to say that the base case, from which I was trying to get away, and I was arguing the case for moving away from that base case, but that base case was optimistic.
Like Daryl here, thank you, Michael Steindl. I'm not remotely an economist, so I may have to appeal to you to help understand my question. When you were talking about the type 2 discount or discount rate 2, if I understood correctly, you were arguing that to the extent we invest in mitigation, we have to acknowledge the cost that comes off normal investment. Would you see a large category of investment that actually crosses both? And two examples I'd be thinking of off the top of my head is investment in renewables more than 100% we need, so that it actually gives us productive export capacity. Yeah. And the other one's gone right out of my head, I'm sorry, but electrification of industry, for example, yeah, where you're actually you're investing in industry, but you're also investing in mitigation.
Yeah. Well, what you're alluding to is what Malty referred to as the fish going belly up. And frankly, I did not contemplate that likelihood. I did mention the possibility in the report, but I didn't think in 2008 or 2011 that was likely. Now it's not only likely, I think it is going to happen. So the world has changed, and if I'd spent less time on the discount rate, I would have spent more time on the reductions in the costs of the new technologies. But I've mentioned them, and that's another factor. It's not only the discount rate; it's the cost reduction, the new technologies that bring this up. And this is going to be the theme of a couple of the future lectures, and then of the final lecture. I think this is transformative opportunity for Australia, and I now have no doubt that partly as a result of the fall in the cost of capital and partly as a result of the improvements in technology reduction in costs of the capital goods, that we can have much cheaper energy with the new technologies relatively soon. And with the whole world moving towards low emissions production systems, and I think the whole world is, despite Donald Trump and Mr. Morrison and his lump of coal, then that will give Australia a distinctive advantage. In fact, on purely economic grounds, it's hard to see any reason why Australian iron oxide, currently exported at 1 billion tonnes a year, we wouldn't turn our sun and wind into hydrogen and reduce iron oxide into iron metal before sending it away, so that we'd have 1 billion tonne, or 600 million tonne, after the oxygen's gone, 600 million tonne iron export industry. Yeah, that's economically the natural way Australia would go if we grasp the opportunity. So my starting point was to, in what cost looked like then, there was a cost in the early years. In some industries, there still will be a cost in early years, but in the economy as a whole, that's much less clear now than it was then. And in areas where we can get big cost advantages by using the new technologies, I can now see an opportunity for a big expansion of them, so that the benefits there outweigh the higher costs in some other parts of the economy.
We've got another one from online. This one comes from Amy Steele. who asks, in the private sector, we are already seeing the cost of capital impacted by divestment. For example, it's now harder to borrow funds for coal than it was previously. Would this impact the intertemporal utility discount rate for Australia that you would use, or would that go into the type 1 and 2 market considerations?
Well, that's the business rate, but the higher, it's not true that business in general is facing higher interest rates. We do have a problem in our monopolized banking sector, but and that's a greater problem in Australia than in other countries. But in general, costs of capital are coming down to business. There's a specific issue in relation to investment in fossil fuels. There's now a very large risk associated with that, or a risk of two kinds. One, that the investment will be made redundant by the greater improved competitiveness of low emissions technology, so it's a conventional economic risk of loss. And there's also a risk that restrictions on carbon emissions or pricing of carbon emissions or support for low emissions technologies will further reduce the competitiveness of coal. So naturally, it's difficult to get capital for investments that have become much more risky.
Professor, it's Erwin Boermans here. You alluded in your last lecture about making impact and saying it how it is. We've got this Swedish fantastic young girl calling it all over the world very bluntly how it is. What's your views? Do we need to replicate that and say it in very blunt terms to support the movement that's now coming up from the youth with the climate strikes?
Oh, I think that that when me and my generation are dead, we'll have a much better chance. I think young people are less blinded by old shibboleths, and I think there is that we will get faster movement as the people who are younger now and have grown up with this issue are more influential in our polity.
Hi, Kate Wenigal. I don't know anything about economics, but my question is, from what I hear you saying, up until now we've been trying to get towards 100% renewable energy here in Australia, and now you're actually indicating that we could get to 300, 400, 500%. Is that the direction we're heading?
Yeah, I think there's a business opportunity. Of course, some businesses have to make it happen, but I now think it's a rather natural thing. I think it would be economically irrational for energy-intensive industries processing Australian raw materials not to do it in Australia, because the cost of Australian renewable energy is lower than the cost of low emissions energy in other places, and the minerals are here. And a lot of mineral processing is very emissions intensive. Aluminium smelting is the most energy intensive of the established big industries. So we had a lot of that with smelters in Newcastle, Gladstone, Portland, Bell Bay and Tasmania, all on the basis of, except for Bell Bay on hydro, the rest were on the basis of low cost coal, low cost in a global basis. Well, the advantage that we'll have with renewable energy will be at least as large, I think larger. Steel, iron metal will be made in the low carbon world economy increasingly from zero emission sources. Costs are currently higher for hydrogen-based routes, hydrogen and renewable energy, but less higher in Australia than other places because of the low cost of renewable energy. And then the new technologies are generating demand for new products that require a lot of energy. The main material required for photovoltaic panels is pure silicon. Well, what silicon is sand and quartz. We've got a bit of sand and quartz and a huge amount of energy, getting rid of the oxygen and from it. I think that expansion of these industries is, we can muck it up, but if we don't muck it up, it's naturally a very important part of our future.
We have one last question in the interest of time, I would say, from another online viewer, and then we close for today.
This one comes from Michael Lord, and it's a pretty hairy one, Ross. It's, if we accept that climate change might lead to the extinction of thousands of species, including our own, why base the case for action on economic modelling? In particular, because economic modelling requires implicitly or otherwise putting a price on death. So do you think that economic modelling is important in itself, or is it important to convince politicians who speak the language of economics?
Well, I don't think economic matters are irrelevant. I think you do have to do the sums on that. Just on climate change and the extinction of our species, I think climate change could make life miserable for humans. I doubt that climate change would be a source of extinction. We've got other ways in which we might do that. But I think it's quite legitimate for people to be concerned about the effects of strong mitigation on living standards. And the work that I did showed that even when you took that into account, there was still a very strong case for mitigation. That wasn't a good reason for not doing it. And because a lot of people do worry about those things, not just politicians, a lot of Australians worry about effects on living standards or the cost of power, I think it's legitimate to do that work. Now, I think at the same time, we do have to recognize that there are important values that are not the subject of conventional economic modelling. And right from my first review, I did put far more effort than any other economist has into highlighting the importance of those and trying to put forward in my review a lot of those effects. But I think that those non-economic values were taken much more seriously when Pope Francis said it than when I did.
Thank you so much. We are blessed that we are only in the second lecture of a series of 6. And if you want to participate in the next 4, you can sign up at any of these institutions where we have the banners here, the Climate College, the Melbourne Energy Institute, there's Melbourne Sustainable Society Institute, our hub, or the Faculty of Business and Economics. For the next 3 lectures, they're again here. And the last lecture will be again in a big lecture hall. If you don't get a ticket for the next 3 lectures, come anyway. The youth is marching on the street. The youth might then have to stand in the back. But if you don't get a ticket for the next 3 lectures, please join us here anyway. And it's every Wednesday from now on at 6:30 until the elections. So until Wednesday, the 15th of May.
The elections came after.
So join me again in thanking for a fantastic tour in the economics, in the complex economics of climate change. We're very much looking forward to the books where even more of the background is spelled out. Thank you so much, Ross, for tonight.